While all eyes have been focused on Iran this week, President Trump made clear that he is operating on a grander theater of war. Here's what the president said. I'm surprised that Zelenskyj doesn't want to make a deal. Tell Zelenskyj to make a deal because Putin's willing to make a deal. Zelenskyj is far more difficult to deal with. The president just told you who is blocking the peace. And this week, Russia's foreign ministry took it a step higher and laid the blame directly on the British. Two great powers pointing in the same direction. That is not a coincidence. That is the sound of the British imperial chessboard being flipped over. So today I'm going to take you out of the fog of the immediate war and all the propaganda around Iran and show you how the strategic map of the entire world is being redrawn in real time by sovereign nations acting in their own interests for the first time in 80 years. Now, the establishment media wants you totally focused on Iran, whether it's the CNN narrative that Trump doesn't have a plan and we're in for chaos, or the Fox narrative that he's out for regime change, or that this is a masterstroke against Russia and China. They want you trapped in their narrative. What they don't want you to see is the big picture. They're reporting from inside the old paradigm. But if you zoom out, you'll see something entirely different. This week, the outlines of a new world order, a real one, not Mark Carney's, began to emerge. Great powers acting in their own sovereign interests, converging against the forces of permanent manufactured conflict. I'm Susan Kokinda. I've tracked the imperial great game for decades, not the puppet show and the headlines, but the real architecture of power. The empire doesn't fight its own wars. It manages them. It needs great powers in permanent conflict because that's what keeps it in control. What we are now seeing is that architecture beginning to fail on every front simultaneously. So if you want to understand how that is unfolding, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons so we can stay in touch and we can reach more people. Here's what I'm going to cover today. First, Trump's identification of Zelenskyj as the obstacle to peace, with a side note on Israel. Second, Russia's identification of Britain as the obstacle to peace. And third, what Russia and China didn't do in the UN Security Council and what it means. So let's start with what the president actually told us this week. Because in the same 7 days, Donald Trump drew a line on the record in his own words, separating American objectives from the agendas of two of the empire's most important instruments. And most people missed it because they were watching two different stories instead of one. So on Ukraine, you already heard what he told NBC. Putin is willing to make a deal. Zelenskyj is the obstacle. But there's a second quote from that same interview that is just as important. When Zelenskyj offered to help the United States intercept Iranian drones, Trump's response was immediate. Zelenskyj is the last person we need help from. Let that land. The man whose war the entire transatlantic establishment has demanded America fund, arm, and defend at any cost, Trump just told you he's the last person whose help he wants. Now turn to Iran. In the same week at Joint Base Andrews, a reporter asked the president directly whether American objectives in Iran are the same as Israel's. And here's what the president said.
Are you speaking with Prime Minister Netanyahu? And are your objectives the same in terms of ending the war?
I think they might be a little different, I guess. You know, they're a different country than we are.
Then Defense Secretary Hegseth said the same thing. When asked about Israel striking Iranian oil facilities, which was not a stated American objective, Hegseth said,
Well, I would just state by saying Israel's been a really strong partner in this effort. Where they have different objectives, they've pursued them. Ultimately, we've stayed focused on ours.
So on two different fronts, Ukraine and Iran, the U.S. is pursuing its own objectives. On Ukraine, Trump is saying that Putin is the reasonable party and Zelenskyj is the obstacle. On Iran, Trump is telling Netanyahu, whose war aims include permanent regime change and an indefinite timeline, that America has different objectives. And President Trump has already acted on that difference, sending Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Israel after they bombed an oil refinery to tell Israel to stop hitting domestic economic targets. The U.S. wants a stable Iran with a functioning economy when the fighting is over. These are not mixed messages. This is a president refusing on both fronts to be managed by the empire's pawns. And Russia just gave the empire a name. But before I get to that, if you're finding this kind of analysis, that is the real architecture behind the headlines, useful, then you need to be subscribed to Promethean Action's free newsletter. We've been tracking the imperial great game for decades, and right now, that work has never mattered more. So use the link in the description to sign up for our newsletter. So while President Trump was identifying Zelenskyj as the obstacle to peace, the Russian Foreign Ministry took it a step higher. On March 10th, British Storm Shadow missiles struck a civilian district of Bryansk in Russia. 7 people killed, dozens were wounded. Russia's foreign ministry did not issue a generic condemnation of Western aggression. They named the British directly. They said, "It is evident that Britain has become deeply entangled in geopolitical games, seeking to strengthen its status as the informal leader of European hawks on the Ukrainian track and as Russia's irreconcilable adversary." And then they accused Britain of sabotaging the American-led peace process. We have also noted that British weapons were used at a time when political and diplomatic efforts to settle the Ukrainian crisis in the trilateral Russia-US-Ukraine format are intensifying. The obvious goal of London and other Western capitals is to stage a large-scale provocation involving civilian casualties in order to derail the peace process and escalate hostilities. Russia is naming Britain by name. Chatham House, the empire's premier foreign policy think tank, came out and bluntly admitted it with the headline, "Europe is helping Ukraine resist a U.S. push for peace at any price." Britain's own brain trust has stated its mission openly: prevent the President of the United States from ending this war. Then look at what Zelenskyj did in the same week. He threatened the life of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, a sitting EU head of state. Zelenskyj told a government meeting that he would give Orbán's address to Ukrainian soldiers so they could, in his words, call him and speak with him in their own language. This was so outrageous that even the European Union had to denounce Zelenskyj, stating that the type of language used yesterday by President Zelenskyj is not acceptable. There must be no threats against EU member states. And even Orbán's main political opponent in Hungary, who is running against him in next month's elections, demanded that Zelenskyj apologize to all Hungarian citizens. Think about what you just witnessed. The empire's primary instrument in Europe, the leader it spent 3 years portraying as a heroic defender of Western democracy, threatening to have a NATO ally's head of government killed, and the empire's own European Union institutions had to publicly repudiate him. Britain is now named as the opponent of peace. Zelenskyj is increasingly isolated even within his own alliance. Now put that in context of what happened at the UN. On March 11th, the United Nations Security Council voted on a resolution brought by the Gulf states and others, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan, condemning Iran's missile and drone attacks on their territories. 135 nations co-sponsored it. The resolution passed 13-0, which means that Russia abstained and China abstained. Neither used their veto. Now, the mainstream media barely reported this, but I want you to understand what it actually means, because you won't understand it if you're in the old geopolitical world that gives you headlines that portray Russia and China as locked into their support for Iran, as this one on Fox does, or as the Ukrainian press continues to try and portray Iran, Russia, and China as the new axis of evil. But every rule of the old Cold War playbook, the binary the empire has relied on for 80 years, by those rules, Russia and China should have vetoed this resolution. That's what the script called for: protect your partner, block the Western initiative, keep the great powers in their assigned corners. But they didn't. This is a new strategic reality, one in which nations are taking themselves off the British geopolitical chessboard. And if you're paying attention to what President Trump said on March 13th, you'll actually see it in action. He was asked if Russia was helping Iran.
You think Putin is helping them? I think he might be helping them a little bit, yeah, I guess. And he probably thinks we're helping Ukraine, right?
And you are, right?
Yeah, we're helping them also. And so he says that. And China would say the same thing. You know, it's like, hey, they do it and we do it, in all fairness. They do it and we do it.
Think about that. The President of the United States just placed America, Russia, and China on the same plane of sovereign nations acting in their own interests. Not enemies locked in permanent ideological combat. Countries that do what they do in their own interests and deal with each other on that basis. And he didn't just say it, he acted on it. The United States has announced a temporary lifting of sanctions on Russian oil stranded at sea in order to stabilize the energy markets roiled by the Iran war. And when he was asked about China, Iran's largest trading partner, Trump didn't threaten Beijing. He said the United States' efforts to keep the Strait of Hormuz open was in China's interest too. That is the sovereign realism at the heart of the administration's national security strategy and national defense strategy. Both of those new doctrines explicitly reject the post-war paradigm of permanent great power conflict. Now, connect this to everything we've covered today. Trump telling NBC that Putin wants peace and Zelenskyj is the obstacle. Trump telling the press that American objectives in Iran are different from Israel's. Russia naming Britain as the saboteur of the peace channel. And Russia and China declining to shield Iran's destabilizing behavior against sovereign Arab nations. What you're looking at is the same thing. Great powers, the United States, Russia, China, beginning to act on converging sovereign interests rather than playing their assigned roles in someone else's great game. This is the new strategic map being redrawn. And the empire, whose entire system depends on keeping great powers in permanent conflict, has no moves left that don't accelerate its own exposure. Now, Promethean Action is doing more than just exposing. We're building a movement that can defeat this. And understanding and backing Trump's strategic and economic revolution is a critical part of that. So if you want to be part of that fight, join us at Promethean Action as a supporting member or a contributor. This has been your Monday Brief. Thanks for watching.
Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at prometheanaction.com.